The whisper came so low it barely rose above the stove's last ticking heat. If we leave by dawn, just say so. Marin Torvik stood at the kitchen table with one hand braced against the flour bin and the other curled tight around a dish towel she had twisted nearly to tearing. The lamp was turned low. Her daughter Pearl and little Milo were asleep in the room off the pantry, and the whole house had that hollow stillness of a place listening for trouble. Across from her, Jonas Red sat on the bench by the wall, his long legs stretched out, his hat on the floor by his boots, a harness buckle in his hands he had been mending for no good reason, except a man needed something to do when words might change too much. He did not answer. Marin gave one short nod, as if she had expected no better, and turned away before he could see her face clearly. By first light, she came down the stairs with both children dressed, one carpetbag in hand, and fear set plain in the lines beside her mouth. She stopped so suddenly Pearl bumped into her skirts. Jonas had already built the fire up. Coffee steamed near the stove. Biscuits sat wrapped in a clean cloth. There was bacon in the pan, and fried apples sweetening in their own juices. On the oilcloth table, he had set out 4 tin plates, for cups, for forks. Not 3, 4. The wagon was hitched outside. Marin looked at the table, then at him, and whatever she had meant to say did not come. Jonas only took the coffee pot off the flame and said, in the same quiet voice he used for weather and harness leather and skittish horses, "If we mean to beat Cyrus to the county road, we'd best eat while it's hot." That was how they left the farm. Not with shouting, not with tears fit for company, just with bacon smoke in the kitchen, a little boy too sleepy to understand the shape of what was being taken from him, a girl old enough to know danger when it wore a waistcoat and called itself family, and a man who had no claim to any of them setting breakfast as though he had counted them in his life before any of them had dared to. Cyrus Torvik had come the afternoon before, clean-shaven and polished as a coffin handle, carrying papers in a calfskin folder and the sort of patience that had meanness hidden beneath it. He had stood in Marin's yard looking over the milch cow, the split-rail fence, the wash line, the orchard stumps that might bear well in another year, and he had spoken as if appraising goods after an auction. Ansel had been dead not quite 7 months then, killed under a freight wagon south of Casper when the rear axle snapped on bad ruts. He had left Marin the place in every way that mattered to decent people, through labor, through love, through the plain fact that they had built it side by side. But the law was a colder thing than a marriage bed or a fieldstone hearth. No formal will had been found. The notes Cyrus now produced claimed Ansel had borrowed heavily against the property 2 years earlier. With interest added and payment unmet, Cyrus said the land had to be placed under his supervision until debts were satisfied. For the good of the family, for the children's future, for order. Marin had read only enough to know the signature looked like Ansel's, and the numbers did not. "He paid you in stock after the hard winter," she had said. Cyrus had smiled without warmth. "He paid part. He told me it was settled." A good many men tell their wives soothing things when there isn't enough to soothe. Jonas had been fixing the north fence where the frost heave had lifted 2 posts. He had come around the corner of the house at that, carrying his hammer, not hurrying, just arriving in the way of a man who understood how to enter trouble without enlarging it. Cyrus had looked him over and dismissed him at once as hired muscle that could be handled later. "You've till tomorrow noon," Cyrus had told Marin, sliding the papers back into the folder. "Sign a temporary transfer, and I'll see you and the children remain in the house. Refuse, and I'll return with a deputy. I know you're in no position for pride." He had let his gaze travel toward the barn, the root cellar, the pasture beyond. Then he had added, too casually, "There's another arrangement that would spare public ugliness." Marin had gone very still. Pearl, standing in the doorway with her school reader against her apron, had gone white. Jonas said nothing. He only shifted the hammer once in his hand. Cyrus took his horse and rode off with the same measured ease he had brought with him, leaving his threat behind like dust that did not settle. That evening Marin had fed the children, washed their faces, and folded clothes into a carpetbag after they were asleep. She had checked the blue crock where she kept money twice and found the same small sum both times. She had stood at the sink looking out into a yard silvered by moonlight, and when she heard Jonas come in from the bunkhouse to bank the kitchen fire, she had said the only thing left in her to say. If they leave by dawn, just say so. And now dawn had come, and he had answered with 4 plates. They ate quickly. Pearl kept glancing from Jonas to the window, as if Cyrus might already be riding down the lane. Milo, who was 6 and had the serious eyes of a much older child, asked whether they were going to town for calico. Marin smoothed his hair and said, "For papers first." He accepted that, because children will accept almost anything if the grown voice telling it stays steady. Jonas carried the bags out and lashed them under the wagon seat. He moved with a slight drag in his right leg, not enough to slow him much, just enough to mark old damage. He had come to the farm in late autumn looking for work and a place to winter. Ansel had known him from freight runs years before and had taken him on for repairs and woodcutting, saying the man was useful and mostly silent, both of which suited a hard season. After Ansel's death, Jonas had stayed on because fences still broke, pumps still froze, and there were some griefs too heavy for a woman to carry alone if a decent man happened to be standing nearby. That was all Marin had allowed herself to call it. Decency. Help. Nothing more dangerous than that. The morning was raw and pale. Frost still clung in the wagon ruts where the sun had not reached, though the hills beyond Cottonwood Crossing wore the color of thaw. East of the Bighorns, spring came by argument rather than agreement. One day was mud, the next iron ground again. Jonas lifted Milo to the seat, then Pearl. When he turned to Marin, she was tying her bonnet with fingers not quite steady. He waited until she had finished. There was courtesy in that. He did not fuss over her, which she would have hated. He only said, "I'll drive the first stretch. You keep watch behind." So she did. They took the south road instead of the main track into town, cut across a meadow gone half to standing water, and reached the cottonwoods by the creek before the sun was full up. Jonas knew the back ways. She had guessed as much from how easily he read land, how often he looked not at the obvious grade but at the slope beside it, the way snowmelt moved, the way a wheel might bite or slide. After an hour, Pearl began to loosen from her rigid silence. She held Milo between herself and the wagon rail each time they lurched. Once, when Jonas turned the team through a wash where brush slapped the wheels, she asked, "Will Uncle Cyrus come after us?" Jonas answered before Marin could shape a gentler lie. "Yes." Pearl swallowed. "Will he catch us?" "No." The child studied the back of his coat for a time, perhaps measuring whether such plain certainty could be trusted. Then she nodded once, satisfied for the moment. Not long after, when the road widened and the team settled into a better pull, Marin said, "You could still turn us toward my cousin's place near KC. If your mind's altered." "It isn't. He may say I coaxed you into stealing children from their lawful guardian. He may say the moon's made of lard. Don't make it so." That nearly pulled a smile from her. Nearly. Jonas kept his eyes on the road. "If Cyrus reaches the county clerk before we do, he'll work faster than truth can walk. Hiding won't help you. We go to Buffalo. We file what we can. Then we find out who witnessed that note." Marin looked at him. "You speak like a man who's seen such things before." His jaw shifted once. "I have seen men use paper the way others use a whip." That was all he said, and she let it rest there. Some people told their stories freely because they wanted them admired. Some held them close because looking too long might wake what had been buried. Jonas was of the second kind. By mid-morning they reached a stage stop where the cook sold coffee through a side hatch and travelers stood stamping their feet in the yard. Jonas watered the team while Marin took the children in for warm milk and a heel of bread. She felt eyes on her before she sat down. A woman in a plum shawl glanced from Marin to the door where Jonas stood visible through the window, then to Pearl and Milo, and lowered her voice to the companion beside her in that manner meant not to hide anything at all. "So that's her." Marin kept her face to the table. "Not even a year, I heard." "Well, some women cannot abide a winter alone." Pearl's ears pinked at once. She bent lower over her cup. Marin might have risen then and spoken sharp enough to split the room, but she saw what that would buy her. More talk, more relish. She laid one hand over Pearl's wrist instead. When Jonas came back in, he read the room in a blink. He did not ask. He bought a sack of oats, took the cups from Marin's hands, and said, "Team's ready." Outside, once the wagon was moving again, Pearl said, "Mama, did we do wrong?" Marin turned toward her. "No, but they looked. They would have looked if we stayed too," Marin said, and there was more steel in her voice now than fear. "Listen to me, Pearl. A town will always find itself a story if its own house is quiet. Let them work for one that isn't ours. Jonas flicked the reins lightly. A little while later, without turning, he said, Mrs. Hatcher in that shawl kept company with a drummer out of Cheyenne while her husband was laid up with the ague. Town forgot that quick enough when it found a fresher mouthful. Marin stared at the side of his face. That was the first time she understood that Jonas's silence was not ignorance. He listened. He remembered. He simply spent words as carefully as other men spent coin. If you have ever known the kind of morning when a whole future seemed to fit under a wagon seat and still feel too heavy to move, you would have known that road. It stretched pale ahead of them under a sky scrubbed thin by wind, and every mile sounded like a question nobody could answer yet. They reached Buffalo near sundown, tired and splashed to the knees with mud. The town sat low and wind-worn, boards and brick mixed together as if nobody had yet settled what it wished to become. Wagons crowded Main Street. A blacksmith's hammer rang from an open shed. Somewhere a piano struggled through a tune no one in that room was likely listening to. Jonas drove straight past the hotel and stopped in front of a narrow two-story boarding house with a painted sign that read Dane House. You know the proprietress? Marin asked. I know she keeps her eyes open, he said. Elspeth Dane opened the door before he could knock twice. She was a broad-shouldered woman somewhere past 40, with iron gray hair braided and coiled at the back of her head, and the direct gaze of a person who had learned long ago that politeness and cowardice were not the same thing. Well, she said, taking in wagon, children, carpetbag, and Marin's strained face in one sweep. You look like either bad weather or bad kin has driven you in, and I've no patience for the first. Bring them inside. She put Pearl and Milo in the back room with hot broth and bread almost at once. Then she sat Marin and Jonas at the kitchen table with a lamp between them and said, Now, tell it plain. Marin did. Elspeth asked only sharp, practical questions. What date was on the note? Who witnessed it? Had Ansel spoken of debt before he died? Had Cyrus yet filed with the court? When Marin finished, Elspeth leaned back. He's moving quick because he's not acting alone. Marin frowned. What do you mean? I mean men like Cyrus do not usually wake one morning and learn to use legal language on their own. There's a cattle syndicate buying up creek access east of the mountains. Small holders who sit between their grazing routes and the rail spurs have suddenly found old debts remembered, boundary lines argued, widows pressed. My brother lost 40 acres that way. There was no tremor in her voice when she said it. That made the thing sound worse. He drank himself stupid after. Elspeth went on. Then he froze one January trying to walk home from a poker room. So if your Mr. Torvik has come with papers too neat for his own hand, I'd wager there's money behind him. Jonas looked at her. Who? Maybe Baron Kroll. Maybe someone smaller hoping to sell to them. I've heard 3 names and trust none. Elspeth folded her hands. What I need to know is whether your husband truly signed that note. No, Marin said at once. Knowing and proving are cousins that seldom visit at the same hour. Marin's face tightened. Then what would you have me do? Fight in daylight. Elspeth nodded toward the front room where the children's voices carried faintly through the wall. You go to the clerk first thing. File objection. Ask for delay. Then we search for anything Cyrus did not expect you to have. Men who cheat assume everyone else has less patience than they do. I have little patience left, Marin said. Good. Save it for use. That night Marin lay beside Pearl and Milo in the narrow rented room and did not sleep much. The mattress dipped in the middle. Wind fussed at the eaves. Downstairs she heard late footsteps once, then quiet. Near midnight she rose, wrapped her shawl over her nightdress, and stepped into the hall for water. Jonas sat on the landing by the back stairs, hat in his hands. He stood at once. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. You did not. He looked worn in the weak hall light, more than the day's road could account for. There were deep lines at the corners of his eyes that a man earned by squinting into weather and regret. You ought to sleep, Marin said. So ought you. She leaned one shoulder against the wall. If we lose tomorrow, he'll come for the children first. That's what men like Cyrus always know how to do. They talk about property till they remember the part of you that breathes. Jonas said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, Why didn't you go to your cousin when Ansel died? Because I was ashamed. He waited. Marin looked down at the tin cup in her hand. Not of him. Of needing. There's a kind of poverty that neighbors understand. Poor harvest, sick milk cow, stovepipe gone wrong. But being a widow with 2 children and a place not fully paid for, folk begin to look at you like weather damage. A thing likely to spread. She gave a small, humorless breath. And because Ansel loved that place, he planted those apple starts with Pearl tucked in a wash basket so she wouldn't crawl into the furrows. Jonas's gaze softened, but he did not reach toward her. That, more than any easy comfort might have done, loosened something in her chest. I am glad you set 4 plates, she said quietly. He looked at the stairs, not at her. I was hungry. For the first time all day, Marin smiled. In the morning the clerk accepted her objection with a face that suggested objections from women were a mild inconvenience of modern life. He told her the probate judge could grant a temporary stay if compelling evidence existed. He did not say what might count as compelling. Cyrus, he let slip, had indeed filed preliminary papers the day before. By noon the whole business had already started to gather a shape in town. Men outside the mercantile glanced up when Jonas crossed the boardwalk. 2 women turned their heads together as Marin and the children passed. Respectability had always been a coat others claimed the right to button and unbutton on a woman's body. Marin felt the town trying its fingers at the seams. Elspeth, who noticed everything, noticed that too. Let them choke on it, she said, taking Pearl by the shoulders and setting her to shelling peas in the boarding house kitchen. We have work. The work proved smaller and harder than anyone liked. Marin had brought the household account book, Ansel's Bible, a cigar tin of receipts, and the folded marriage certificate that had once seemed like enough protection for a whole life. There were feed tallies, seed orders, 2 freight wages, a doctor's bill after Milo's fever. Nothing that disproved Cyrus. Nothing that saved them. Jonas searched with them, though he handled Ansel's things with a care so quiet it was almost reverence. Once he paused over a receipt, brow furrowed, then set it down again. Toward evening Elspeth was called out by a supplier at the back door. While Marin was refolding clothes from the carpet bag, Pearl wandered in carrying Ansel's old Sunday coat. This seems come loose, she said. Can I take the buttons for my rag doll? Marin turned. No, child. Not yet. Pearl frowned at the coat lining where coarse thread had split near the hem. Papa stitched that himself after Christmas. I asked why he mended the inside where nobody could see, and he said mice could not read. The room went still. Jonas crossed it in 3 strides. Show me. He turned the coat inside out and ran his fingers along the hem. Something crackled beneath the lining. Marin sank onto the edge of the bed without meaning to. Jonas took out his pocket knife and carefully slit the rest of the seam. A folded oilskin packet slid into his palm. Inside was a letter, worn but dry. Marin knew Ansel's hand at once. She could not make herself open it. Jonas handed it over without a word. Her fingers shook so badly Pearl had to steady the lower edge of the page while she read. Marin, if this reaches you by any road other than my own hand, it means I waited too long and the fault of that is mine. Cyrus pressed me last fall to sign over creek passage for a cattle contract I would not name to you because I was ashamed to be courted by greed. When I refused, he brought up the winter debt and said he would write it otherwise. I paid him in steers and labor by March and have his receipt, along with the original abstract from your father, hidden under the loose plank in the smokehouse loft. If I return, I mean to record it proper. If I do not, trust no note he shows you after the 12th day of April, for that was the day the matter was closed. Jonas read, knows the sort of men Cyrus now rides with. He will not like me naming him, but he is steadier than he wishes to appear. If there is any decency left in what I have borrowed from this life, it is in leaving you one true friend beside what little I can leave in land. I should have said sooner that the place was never only mine. It was ours from the first post set. Forgive my slowness in putting plain things plain. Ansel. Marin read the letter through once, then again more slowly, and by the second time the room had blurred. Pearl began to cry first. Not loud, just with the stunned, leaking grief of a child who had found a voice from the dead where she expected only cloth and dust. Milo, confused, pressed against Marin's side. Mama. She folded over him and Pearl both. For a while she could not speak at all. When at last she lifted her head, Jonas was standing by the window looking out into the alley, his shoulders set hard. You knew? She asked. His silence was answer enough for half a breath too long. I knew Cyrus had company behind him, he said. I did not know what Ansel hid or where. But he named you. Jonas turned then, and whatever she saw in his face made her colder than anger alone would have done. I rode 3 years with a stock association south of Casper, he said. They called it range protection. Some of it was. Some of it was running small men off water by winter and calling the law after. I carried notices. I stood watch while fences came down. Once I helped serve papers to a widow near Medicine Bow. She had 2 boys. I told myself it was lawful because the stamp at the bottom said so. Marin stared at him. The cabin caught fire that same night after a lamp was kicked in the confusion, he went on. His voice never rose, but it grew rougher with each word. 1 boy lived. 1 did not. I left that work after. Haven't touched it since. Pearl had gone still again. Even Milo, who understood little of the details, seemed to understand the weight. Jonas did not ask for pardon. Ansel knew where I'd been. Took me on anyway when other men would not. So if you want me out of this house, say it, and I'll go. That was the blow hidden in the lining. Not only the letter but the man standing 2 paces away from her, suddenly illuminated by a harsher light. Marin felt anger rise sharp and clean. At him, at Ansel for trusting without telling her, at the whole world of men who made choices and handed women the weather from them afterward. Then Elspeth came back in, took one look at the room, and said, "What happened?" Marin handed her the letter. Elspeth read fast. "Smokehouse loft," she said. "Then that's where we go." Jonas spoke at once. "Cyrus may already be there." "All the more reason," Elspeth replied. She turned to Marin. "You can stay in town, send for the deputy, and hope he doesn't strip the place before morning. Or you can ride back tonight and put your own hand on what's yours." Marin rose slowly. There was fear in her still. There would be for a long time. But there was something else now, a kind of heat that made fear less useful. "I'm going back," she said. Jonas looked at her, waiting. She met his eyes. "And you're coming with me." It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was trust in motion, which was sometimes the only form forgiveness could take at first. The road back was worse by lantern light. Spring clouds had thickened, and by the time they cleared town, sleet had begun to hiss against the wagon cover. Elspeth came too, wrapped in a heavy cloak, with a carpet satchel of her own and a derringer she showed nobody unless there was need. She had left the boarding house to a hired girl and sent a message to Deputy Nels Varda, a cautious man she believed still preferred truth to convenience, though not always quickly. "Caution's a poor horse," she said as the wagon jolted through a rut. "But sometimes it arrives." Pearl and Milo lay bundled in quilts behind the seat. Marin held the lantern low and watched the dark beyond its swing. Jonas drove with the stubborn steadiness of a man who had once spent whole nights staying alive by less. Near midnight, when the sleet thinned to cold rain, he said, "We'll stop at the old sheep camp for an hour. Team needs blowing." They pulled under a rise where a ruined sod hut broke some of the wind. Elspeth slept sitting up. Pearl and Milo did not wake. Marin stood a little apart, listening to the horses crop at wet grass. Jonas came beside her, not too near. "You should have sent me off," he said. "Perhaps. But you didn't." "No." Rain ticked from the brim of his hat. Marin kept her eyes on the dark land ahead. "If I had known all of you yesterday, I might not have trusted you. That would have been fair. But I know something else now, too." She swallowed. "Men who mean harm do not set breakfast for children before daylight." His mouth shifted, almost a wince, almost something gentler. "Some men do both kinds of things in one life." She turned then. "And some spend the rest of it choosing which kind they mean to be." He looked at her a long while, as if the words struck somewhere he did not let many things reach. By dawn they were on the last ridge above the farm. Smoke rose from the chimney. Wagons stood in the yard. Marin's stomach dropped. "He means to hold the inventory today," Elspeth said grimly. "Quick bastard." More wagons were coming by the road from town, neighbors drawn by the promise of cheap stock or free spectacle. That was Cyrus's talent. He wrapped theft in procedure so ordinary people could tell themselves they had simply attended a lawful day. Jonas pulled up behind the stand of cottonwoods rather than ride straight in. "Once we show ourselves, there's no smalling this," he said. Marin looked down at the house. Her house. The porch where Pearl had shelled peas in summer. The line where Ansel had marked the children's heights against the doorframe. The smokehouse off to the east, gray and squat beyond the shed. "If he gets to that loft first." "He won't," Jonas said. "Cyrus'll watch the house," Elspeth murmured. "Not the smokehouse." Men like him never imagine women hearing what they were told in kitchens. Jonas nodded. I'll take the team round the creek bed. Mrs. Dane, you go straight for the yard and stir every eye there. Marin, once they're looking, you cut to the smokehouse. Elspeth smiled without mirth. At last, a use for my reputation. No, Marin said. No, I go in plain. I am done sneaking around my own yard. Jonas studied her face and found he could not move her from the choice. So he only said, then we do it with everyone watching. That was the third true decision she made, and it changed the day. He drove the wagon straight down the lane. Cyrus stood near the porch with a ledger in hand, and 2 hired men beside him. A few neighbors had gathered already, shoulders hunched against the wet, their faces carrying that dreadful mix of discomfort and curiosity people wear when they hope trouble will justify their attendance. Cyrus's expression sharpened when he saw the wagon. Then it smoothed. He stepped forward as if greeting tardy guests. Well now, he said, I feared you'd made matters uglier than need be. Marin climbed down before Jonas could offer help. You had no right to enter my house. Your house is the question before us. Not any longer. Cyrus's eyes flicked to Elspeth, then to Jonas. You fetched witnesses for your disgrace, I see. That did it. Not because the insult cut deepest, but because he said it where Pearl could hear. Pearl stood up in the wagon, cheeks burning. My mama ain't disgraced. Marin put one hand up to steady her. She never took her gaze from Cyrus. You may speak to me, she said, but you will not use my children to dress your lies. A murmur passed through the yard. Cyrus lifted the ledger higher. I am here under authority of filed debt and temporary family guardianship. Deputy will confirm it when he arrives. Then we can wait for him, Marin said. And for this. She drew Ansel's letter from inside her coat and held it up. For the first time, Cyrus's control slipped. Barely, but she saw it. What's that? One of the neighbors asked. A letter from my husband, Marin said clearly, letting her voice carry to the edges of the gathered yard, naming the debt settled and telling where the receipt and original abstract are hidden. Cyrus laughed too fast. Convenient. Perhaps, Elspeth said, stepping up beside Marin. Then it will be just as convenient to fetch them in front of all present. Cyrus's jaw tightened. This is not a fairground. No, Elspeth said. It is a theft with coffee. Jonas moved then, not toward Cyrus, but toward the smokehouse. One of the hired men stepped to block him. Jonas did not raise his voice. Move. The man hesitated. Cyrus snapped, Stand there, Boone. Marin went first. That was the part no one expected. Not Cyrus, who had built his whole morning on the assumption that a respectable widow would fear seen more than loss. Not the neighbors, who shifted as she walked through mud in her plain brown coat with her skirts wet at the hem and her chin high as a flagpole. Not Jonas, perhaps, though something like pride flickered once across his face before he followed at her shoulder. Inside the smokehouse it smelled of cured wood and old salt. The loft plank was where Ansel had said, above the hanging bar near the back. Jonas bent to give Marin his clasped hands as a step, but she put one boot on the lower brace and climbed herself. Her fingers found the edge of the loose board, worked it free, and reached into the dust-dark space beyond. There was oilcloth. Her breath caught. She drew out a second packet tied with twine and climbed back down with it hugged to her chest. Outside, the whole yard seemed to lean closer. Elspeth took the packet, opened it carefully, and gave a low whistle. Receipt. Land abstract. 2 witness signatures. A note of transfer from Marin's late father recorded years before, but never copied in the family chest. Enough, at the very least, to choke Cyrus's easy story. You liar, said old Mrs. Bell from the back of the crowd. No louder than weather, but everybody heard it. Cyrus lunged then, not like a polished man with papers, but like a cornered one. He snatched for the packet. Jonas caught his wrist. The hired man Boone shoved forward. Jonas took the shove badly because of the leg, went half down, and Cyrus got hold of Marin's sleeve hard enough to tear cloth. Pearl screamed. Marin twisted, struck Cyrus across the face with the flat of Ansel's old letter still in her hand, and tore free. It was not much of a blow. It did not need to be. It shocked the yard more than blood would have. At that same moment hoofbeats came sharp through the gate. Deputy Nels Varda rode in with 2 other men behind him, one of them the probate judge's clerk, hair plastered wet to his forehead and irritation plain on his face. What in blazes, the clerk began. In blazes, Elspeth said crisply, is fraud, unlawful seizure, and a public inventory based on a debt closed nearly a year past. Here are the papers. Read faster than he lies, if you can. Everything tightened there. Rain, mud, breath. Cyrus tried one last time to recover the smooth tone of authority. This is a family misunderstanding blown large by hysterics and meddling, he said. My brother was careless. The widow's been led astray by. Enough, Marin said. The word carried. She stepped forward where all of them could see her. Neighbors, deputy, clerk, hired hands. Her children, Jonas with mud on his coat, and pain hidden poorly in the set of his shoulders. She did not tremble now. Perhaps she would later in private, but not there. For 7 months, she said, I have buried my husband, fed my children, kept stock alive through winter, and heard men explain to me what I could not possibly understand about my own life. I understand this well enough. You meant to use my widowhood as a door. You meant to shame me quiet and hurry the law before I could stand in it. You meant to count me weak because I was outnumbered. She looked at Jonas, then at Pearl and Milo. A home is not the place that claims your name. It is the place that makes room for it. Nobody spoke after that. Not at once. The clerk cleared his throat and took the papers from Elspeth with suddenly careful hands. He read the receipt. Read the dates again. Compared signatures. By the time he finished, his face had changed from annoyed to wary. This debt appears satisfied, he said. And this abstract places title through Mrs. Torvik's line with issue rights to the children. He looked sharply at Cyrus. Why was none of this produced in your filing? Cyrus's mouth worked. I never saw those papers. Deputy Varda dismounted slowly. Then you were mighty eager for a man who never saw the rest. Boone, the hired man, took 2 steps back out of the business entirely. Cyrus turned toward Jonas as if an old accusation might still save him. That man has ridden with rustlers and enforcers alike. Ask him what sort of witness you welcome into a widow's yard. Jonas met the deputy's look without flinching. I rode bad work years back. That's true. The crowd stirred. He also brought me home, Marin said before anyone else could dress the fact to their liking. He set food before my children when others set traps. I know the difference. There it was then, the quiet justice of it. Not grand, not theatrical, but plain enough for decent people to stand by. And once plain truth gets into a yard full of watchers, cowardice begins looking expensive. Deputy Varda took Cyrus by the arm. This matter's done for today, he said. You'll come to town and explain your filing. Cyrus jerked back. On her word? On a drifter's? On paper, said the clerk dryly, lifting the packet. Which was your own preferred authority an hour ago. Rain softened to mist. The crowd broke apart in low murmurs, folks suddenly remembering errands elsewhere. Mrs. Bell came up and pressed Pearl's shoulder. Boone slunk off without meeting anyone's eye. Elspeth stood with satisfaction held in as sternly as grace at church. Marin did not feel triumph. Not exactly. What she felt was steadier. The ground under her boots belonged to her again. When Cyrus was let out through the gate, he turned once more and said to Marin, with all the polish gone from him at last, You think they'll forget this? No, she said. I think they'll remember it correctly. That was worse, and he knew it. The house was a wreck inside. Drawers opened, blankets tossed, pantry tins displaced. Yet by evening the beds were made again, the stove relit, and the children asleep under their own roof. Elspeth stayed long enough to make strong tea and promise she would come back for the hearing in town 3 days later. Then she left with the deputy. Jonas lingered on the porch after dark, hat in hand, as if uncertain whether he still belonged inside. Marin found him there. The spare room's yours if you want it, she said. He looked toward the yard. I reckoned I'd sleep in the bunkhouse. You limped half the day and took a shove that would have laid another man flat. I've had worse. I know. She held the screen door open. That is not the same as deserving worse. He came in then. The hearing went as most such hearings go once lies have been pulled into daylight. Slower than justice ought to move, faster than Cyrus had hoped. The note was declared fraudulent in material claim. A lawyer out of Sheridan was found to have drafted related filings for several dubious land transfers. Baring Kroll, whose name indeed surfaced before long, pretended surprise and disavowed direct knowledge. Men with money were forever discovering innocence at the exact hour they needed it. Still, the seizure was stopped. Marin's title was affirmed subject only to ordinary county recording, and Cyrus lost the standing he had prized more than kin. That mattered in a small place. A man can survive being hated if he keeps power. It is ridicule that strips him. Spring moved on. Mud gave way to grass. Calves came healthy. Pearl went back to lessons with her head up. Milo followed Jonas like a burr follows wool, learning nails from spikes, sparrows from wrens, and how to listen to a horse before standing behind it. Elspeth visited twice that summer and left each time with eggs, butter, and a fresh grievance against the whole male structure of the territory, though she admitted now and then a useful exception. Jonas repaired the smokehouse roof, reset the north fence, rebuilt the wagon tongue, and said nothing of leaving until haying was stacked. Marin knew he was thinking of it before he spoke. Men like him, once they had done a hard thing for someone, often felt the old call to vanish before gratitude could turn into claim. He brought it up one evening on the porch while the children chased fireflies in jars. "There's a timber outfit near Red Lodge looking for hands," he said. "Heard of it in town." Marin kept shelling beans into her apron. "I see. I thought to go after first frost." Pearl's laugh drifted from the yard. Milo shouted that he had caught two at once. Jonas looked straight ahead. "I never meant to settle where folks knew too much of me." Marin set the bean bowl down. "That's one way to tell it." He turned. "There's another?" "Yes." She faced him fully. "You never meant to stay where folks might ask more of you than labor." The truth of it landed between them with no place to hide. "I am not a man much practiced at belonging," he said after a while. "No," Marin answered softly. "But you have been practicing." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though roughened by something deeper. The children came pounding up the steps with their glowing jars, and the moment closed without ending. That was often the way of honest things. They were not tied neatly the first time they were held. They were returned to, like a fence line after wind. The first frost came white and thin over the pasture in October. Marin was up before dawn kneading biscuit dough when Jonas came in from the pump with cold on his coat. He set the water bucket down, rubbed his hands once, and stopped. The table had been laid. For plates. For cups. Pearl's blue ribbon hung over the back of her chair where she had left it the night before. Milo's spoon was already crooked from use. Marin stood by the stove in the same kitchen where fear had once thinned her voice to a whisper, and now there was no fear in her at all. Jonas looked from the table to her. She did not make a speech of it. She did not ask in some formal, trembling way that would have let him dodge behind humility or old damage. She only said, "Biscuits'll scorch if you keep staring." He took one step closer. "Marin, stay," she said, turning the dough once more beneath her palms. "Not till snow. Not till fences hold. Stay because there's work if you want it and room if you mean to use it, and because I am tired of pretending the fourth plate keeps setting itself." For a man so spare with words, he looked suddenly unable to find any. Pearl appeared in the doorway with hair half braided and stopped short, reading the room as children do with startling speed. Milo peered around her, saw Jonas still standing there, and frowned. "You ain't leaving, are you?" Jonas's eyes never left Marin's face. "No," he said. Milo nodded as if order had been restored to the world by natural law. "Good. Mama made extra apples." Pearl, who had inherited all her mother's seeing and some of her patience, smiled and went to fetch the butter. There are evenings when a story closes loud, with gun smoke or vengeance or men carried off under curses. This was not that kind. It had earned something quieter and, in its way, harder, a man staying, a woman no longer asking permission to keep what was hers, children learning that safety could be built by hand and served hot before daylight. Years later, folks in Cottonwood Crossing still remembered the morning Cyrus Torvik tried to sell a widow's life out from under her and got answered in his own yard. But what lasted longer than that was simpler. It was the sight of Jonas Red walking up from the lower pasture at dawn, lunch pail in hand, while smoke lifted from Marin's chimney and the kitchen window shone gold against the frost. And if this story found you at the close of your own day, there is a fair chance you knew before they did what that fourth plate meant. By the time the first full snow came, it stood in its place so naturally nobody thought to count. The biscuits steamed, the coffee darkened the cups, and morning light lay across the oilcloth table where four people bowed their heads, reached for warm bread, and began.